Welcome to the Chopin channel. I'm Roberto Poli. What is an impromptu? In a video I published a few months ago titled, "What Would the World Be Without Chopin's Fantasy Impromptu?" I mentioned how the term means on the spur of the moment, improvised, composed without previous preparation, extemporaneous. But at the same time, I made the case that there's absolutely nothing improvisatory about Chopin's impromptus, and that, on the contrary, they display remarkable structural tightness and supreme logic in both harmonic and melodic invention. Chopin's impromptus all follow the ABA plus coda model, achieving an extraordinary balance between form and expression. The second impromptu in F-sharp major, opus 36, presents a freer design, though it still grows from an underlying ABA structure. So one may wonder about the obvious contradiction between title and form. What inspired Chopin to name at least 3 of his works, if not 4, impromptu? Franz Schubert published the first 2 of his 4 impromptus, opus 90, in 1827, a year or so before he died. The third and fourth from the set appeared in print only in 1857, and the second set of 4 impromptus, opus 142, in 1839. Chopin then would have known only the first 2 from Schubert's first set, the one in C minor and E flat major, when he composed and published his first 2 impromptus, opus 29 and opus 36. Chopin spent 2 weeks in Vienna in 1829, then again 8 months there between 1830 and 1831 before settling permanently in Paris, and it's likely that he heard some of Schubert's music there, including the 2 impromptus. But whether or not Chopin actually knew Schubert's first 2 impromptus, the timeline is what's rather striking. Chopin's first impromptu, opus 29, was composed in 1836, roughly 9 years after Schubert published his own first 2 impromptus. And the chronology becomes even tighter when we consider the piece now known as the Fantasy Impromptu, composed sometime around 1834 or 1835. While in Vienna, Chopin must also have encountered piano works by other composers, among them Jan Václav Hugo Voříšek, who had already published impromptus by 1822. Voříšek died at a young age, 34, in 1825. Yet his music remained popular for some time afterward, particularly in Vienna. The title of Schubert's own impromptus was apparently suggested by the publisher Tobias Haslinger, and auspiciously so, since Voříšek's publication of his 6th impromptus, opus 7, had enjoyed immediate success both in Vienna and beyond. So it seems likely that Chopin appropriated the title from works he probably became acquainted with during his stay in Vienna. Yet, strictly speaking, there is very little that is genuinely improvisatory about any of Schubert or Voříšek's impromptus. Most conform closely to established formal models, ternary ABA form with coda, rondo, theme and variations, and so forth. Could impromptu, then, simply have functioned as a kind of placeholder title for works that did not fit comfortably into any specific category? The word itself evoked curiosity, spontaneity, and perhaps even a certain fashionable ambiguity, qualities that must have appealed to a broader audience. As a title, it provided a convenient solution certainly for Schubert and Voříšek, and unquestionably for a composer like Chopin, who generally avoided the programmatic titles that many early 19th century composers had begun to favor. And when we consider Chopin's first impromptu, a brilliant, fast-moving work in ABA form with a contrasting lyrical middle section, what else, objectively speaking, could he have called it? There was no established genre for a fast-paced piece in 4/4 time in ABA form. The alternative might simply have been the completely uninspired and uninspiring title, Piano Piece. The same could be said of the Fantasy Impromptu. Whether or not Chopin ever intended to call it impromptu remains uncertain. We gather that the fantasy part of the title was Julian Fontana's invention upon publishing the piece in 1855, and I discussed that question in the video about it I mentioned earlier. But structurally, the work, once again, follows the same principle, ABA form with coda. The third impromptu in G-flat major opus 51, published in 1843, also follows the same design. But what about the second impromptu, opus 36, which Chopin completed after returning from his extended trip to Mallorca, Marseille, and Nohant in 1839? Structurally, things are not quite so straightforward. The broad outline still follows an ABA design, but the form is treated with far greater sophistication. I'd like to guide the viewer through a brief structural analysis of the piece, but also offer a possible reading of what Chopin may have been thinking as he composed the impromptu. We begin in the luminous world of F-sharp major with a tender, almost unassuming introduction in the middle register played by the left hand alone. What initially seems like a preface turns out to be inseparable from the accompaniment of the lyrical main theme that emerges immediately above it, as though both lines were already implied in the same gesture. The theme unfolds with an easy, almost folk-like continuity. It rises gently from the middle C sharp, touches the octave above its point of origin, and returns to it. As the theme develops, the harmony begins to widen its reach. The second phrase, beginning just like the first, is suddenly pulled into the key of A sharp minor, the mediant, the chord on the third degree of F sharp major. It is a striking turn because it reflects a familiar tonal relationship, but in reverse. What I mean by that is this. Were we in F sharp minor, not major, the chord on the third degree would be A major, which is also the relative major. This would be rather predictable, and many composers rely on this strategy. But here the impromptu begins in a major key. Instead of moving to the relative minor, which would mean descending by a third, Chopin still moves up a third to A sharp minor, thereby challenging the familiar tonal relationship of major key and its relative minor. This subtle mirroring makes the harmonic move slightly exotic. Within this second phrase, simplicity is contrasted with two expressive elements: a more active rhythmic figure with dotted eighth notes, and a delicate fioritura, the ornamental embellishment of a melodic line. But the embellishment is not decorative in any superficial sense. It becomes part of the expressive vocabulary of the theme, expanding its surface while preserving its shape. This is an operatic gesture, and one with a very specific function, which we'll return to shortly. From the peak of A sharp minor, the music gently turns back toward F sharp major, where the opening theme returns slightly varied. What follows is a rethinking more than a repetition. The rhythmic figure and the fioritura introduced just moments earlier are now absorbed into the main material itself, woven into its continuation, so that the melody no longer unfolds in a single line, but in layers of articulation and ornament. This flow is interrupted by a chordal passage, more deliberate in rhythms, but especially heavier in texture, 4 to 5 voices thick, though first cast in the middle upper register. It's a momentary suspension, almost an interruption, a transition built also from the dotted rhythmic figure introduced earlier. Gradually, this gathers into a march-like section, which we identify as the middle section of the impromptu. The character shifts here. What was relatively fluid becomes more grounded, as though the music had suddenly adopted a different posture. The rhythmic figure now takes center stage. We begin in the key of D major, and I think it's important to understand how Chopin arrives there. The chordal transition ends with a cadence in C sharp major, the dominant of the home key F sharp major, enriched by the seventh. Naturally, we expect this harmony to resolve back to F sharp, but Chopin avoids the expected resolution entirely. Instead, he shifts chromatically from C sharp to D, arriving unexpectedly to the key of D major. This is what is called the deceptive cadence. The music leads us toward one destination, only to land, unexpectedly, somewhere else. But there is more to it than just surprise. D major lies a major third below F sharp, just as the key of A sharp minor we saw earlier lies a major third above it. In other words, Chopin balances the structure symmetrically by using thirds, a strategy that introduces great harmonic coloring. The march itself, marked sostenuto, held back, unfolds in a surprisingly virtuosic manner when the left hand begins to feature octave leaps, which are technically far less simple than they may sound. Toward the end of the section, Chopin moves to the key of G major as a momentary tonal center and follows it with a somewhat nebulous transition into the recapitulation. This transition is harmonically extraordinary. Let's listen to it. Here, the dotted figuration that dominates the march gradually dissolves. The sharp edges are softened, the rhythmic tension transforms into flowing triplet motion, which is already casually introduced in these transitional measures. Triplets then become the defining feature of the recapitulation itself. The opening theme returns subtly transformed. The triplets in the left hand landed greater momentum, but also restlessness under the lyrical surface of the right hand. Yet, this is not the only surprise. The recapitulation initially appears not in F sharp major, the home key, but in F major, a semitone or half step below the home key. Eventually, the music finds its way back to F sharp major, but this momentary displacement remains one of the most unusual gestures in the piece. From there, a completely new episode emerges, built from rapid passage work and brilliant light figurations, and less dependent on thematic development. Beneath the brilliance, however, the true melodic line remains in the left hand. The impromptu concludes with the return of the earlier chordal material, recalling the interruption that first led into the march and drawing the work toward a compact, decisive close, punctuated by a surprising fortissimo. Now, from this analysis, we can see, I think, how in the Impromptu Opus 36, Chopin is not quite following the stricter ABA plus coda design found in the other impromptus. This impromptu is a work whose form seems to have grown almost episode by episode, and perhaps to some that may also explain the title. But I really believe that even in this case, impromptu simply offered Chopin a flexible, non-committal label for a piece that did not fall into more conventional categories and that in a way refused to fit neatly beneath suggestive titles. But more importantly, what inspired the music itself? It's not as though Chopin woke up one morning, had breakfast, sat at his Pleyel, cracked his knuckles, and declared, "Today I shall compose an impromptu." Ideas came to him constantly, certainly at the piano through improvisation, but just as often away from it, while walking through Paris, dining with friends, teaching a student, or simply hearing music inwardly. He would then return to the instrument and preserve those ideas in sketches, refining and reorganizing them over time. And one can almost imagine that process unfolding here. Perhaps the lyrical opening was what prompted the idea for the piece. Or it was the march that emerged first, and eventually the two ideas were brought together into a single structure. But then transitions were needed, so Chopin may have devised the chordal interlude that later returns as the coda. The recapitulation may have seemed too direct or too symmetrical, or the piece simply too short this way, so he expanded it with the brilliant virtuosic episode near the end. Even the ending with the sudden fortissimo feels as something discovered only as he faced the need for an assertive gesture to close the work. But beyond questions of form, one may still ask, what is the music actually doing? Could there be behind these pages an unstated dramatic idea? Perhaps the answer lies in the world of opera. The opening of the impromptu already suggests it unmistakably, I think. A brief orchestral prelude, followed by what feels almost like the entrance of a soprano aria, complete with delicate fioritura passages. The melodic line certainly breathes like a singer's line. Even the embellishments seem conceived more vocally than pianistically. When the main body of the aria comes to an end, the texture changes character entirely, moving from the intimate to the overtly choral, the chorus, of course, being an essential element of the grand opéra of the time. One can almost imagine female voices first singing an angelic hymn, then lower voices joining beneath them as the phrase returns an octave lower. We can imagine the chorus singing offstage in hushed, ethereal textures, floating over muted orchestral sonorities and suspended harmonies. We are reminded of the aria Casta Diva from Bellini's Norma, where the choir takes over from where the soprano left off at the end of the first main portion of the aria. Even the fermata before the march feels vocal, operatic, but also theatrical, as though suspending the action for a brief moment before the scene changes. Then comes the march, one of the most familiar archetypes in early 19th century operas. The stages of Paris in the 1830s were filled with such scenes. Ceremonial processions, distant military rhythms, sudden public spectacle interrupting private emotion. The music of Vincenzo Bellini, Giacomo Meyerbeer, Gaetano Donizetti, Fromental Alevi, Daniel Aubert. This was the language of the stage surrounding Chopin. And in the impromptu, the effect is remarkably similar. The soprano aria, followed by a brief choral interlude, gives way to a processional rhythm that gradually expands outward, beginning sotto voce, whispering, before growing into something fully orchestral, public, with the suggestion of brass, percussion, and massed sonorities of the strings. The return of the opening theme evokes the recapitulation of an operatic aria after an interruption in the drama, recognizable but transformed by what has happened in the meantime. The accompaniment is altered, the line more restless, slightly more elaborate. Then comes the brilliant concluding episode where the right hand enters the world of coloratura display, while beneath it the left hand sings its own lyrical line, almost the suggestion of a tenor aria paired with a soprano in virtuosic flight. Naturally, the entire scene is stylized, absorbed into the language and technique of the piano. But the references, at least to my mind, are unmistakable. Finally, the chordal interlude returns as the coda, gathering the work back into itself. And although the ending may seem almost unwarranted, the sudden fortissimo after a rarefied atmosphere, even this belongs to the world of opera. One might find similar gestures in the Parisian operas that Chopin knew intimately. The music thins, a final vocal phrase hovers in suspension, and then an orchestral outburst closes the curtain. It's difficult not to think here of Robert le Diable by Giacomo Meyerbeer, one of the first operas that Chopin heard in Paris in 1831, or Le Huguenot, also by Meyerbeer, premiered in 1836, works that Chopin knew well. Theatricality in Chopin is rarely literal, but in the Second Impromptu it seems almost impossible to ignore. For all its apparent formal freedom, the piece unfolds almost like a miniature opera without words, an aria, a choral interlude, a processional march, the return of the aria, a tenor and soprano duet with a virtuoso vocal display in the soprano line, the return of the choral interlude, and finally a curtain fall. Perhaps the title Impromptu, despite its practical function, in indirect ways ends up suiting this work after all. Not because the piece is truly improvisatory in form or musical intention, but because it creates the illusion of spontaneous dramatic invention unfolding before us, scene by scene, as though Chopin himself were discovering the music in real time.